The fall conference season is right around the corner, and we've got two events that you need to put on your calendar. On October 19th, we are back with Transition AI New York. Transition AI is the leading B2B event for energy practitioners and artificial intelligence experts. The New York event will explore current use cases and deployments within electric utilities, the role AI can play in streamlining project development, maximizing revenues, and integrating DERs. Plus, I'm going to do some live interviews and storytelling on stage. We'll present some deep market research, and we'll have a workshop on use cases. Our listeners get 10% off by using the promo code PSPODS10. Come join me, our journalists and researchers, and a bunch of experts in Manhattan for Transition AI. Register at the link in the show notes or go to transition-ai.com. And for you West Coasters, Canary Media is holding another Canary Live. This one is in Berkeley, California. It is on October 3rd. These events are super fun. We've hosted a couple of them with Canary. Panelists are handpicked by the Canary editorial team, and they'll dive into all things related to the energy transition, the Inflation Reduction Act, technology, and innovation. Drink, eat, socialize with clean energy leaders, investors, inventors, public leaders, and advocates. You can follow the link in the show notes to get your tickets to Canary Live Bay Area today. Transition AI New York, Canary Live Bay Area. Put them on your fall calendar for October. We'll see you there.
From the studios of Postscript Media and Canary Media.
So is anyone here marking the Inflation Reduction Act's birthday with a special celebration? Y'all doing anything fun?
Once we get all our stories done, we could go celebrate.
Like a U.S.-made battery with icing on top, something like that?
Keep the candles away from those.
I'm having a dinosaur-themed pizza party for my 3-year-old. I guess we could, add some signage up for IRA, too.
You could, set up a big wind gearbox and put a swing in it for the 3-year-olds.
Yeah.
Make it leave the dinosaurs in the ground themed party.
Yeah.
There you go. The IRA is 1 year old, and it's already reshaping the energy and automotive industries here in the U.S. New factories for a wide array of clean energy components are being planned. Old factories are being reopened, retooled, or expanded. According to a Canary Media analysis, that's amounting to over $70 billion in new investments in the manufacturing sector alone. That includes electric cars, EV parts, batteries, battery recycling, and wind and solar assembly. Wind, solar, and battery developers are also planning major increases in deal flow and projects thanks to expanded tax credits. Meanwhile, companies building an emerging set of technologies like carbon removal, hydrogen, and novel long-duration storage are also expanding. But there are plenty of debates and uncertainties, ranging from how to structure subsidies, who benefits from them, and whether they'll be enough to keep supply chains in America for the long haul. Not to mention, how do we integrate all these new renewables given our severe grid constraints? This is The Carbon Copy. I'm Stephen Lacey. This week, a conversation with 3 journalists who are trying to figure out the lasting impacts of the IRA.
America's green banks are preparing to unleash a wave of capital for clean energy. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund invests a historic $27 billion in projects nationwide. This could mobilize up to $150 billion of private capital for solar, storage, efficiency, and electrification in underserved communities. So how do we deploy those billions quickly, efficiently, and with the highest impact? On July 18th, Latitude Media and Banyan Infrastructure will host a virtual event exploring the on-the-ground realities of making America's green banks a success. Register for free by clicking the link in the show notes or go to latitudemedia.com/events.
Clean energy and climate tech are policy-driven industries, and anyone working in this field touches local, state, and federal policy in a very real way. And that's why you should be listening to Political Climate, a podcast from Latitude Media and Boundary Stone Partners that delivers an insider's view on climate policy and politics. Every other week, co-hosts Julia Piper, Emily Domenech, and Brandon Hurlbut cover the nuances of government funding, regulations, backroom negotiations, and the election, of course. Political Climate is a show for people who want authentic conversations and strong opinions from voices across the political spectrum. Listen at latitudemedia.com or subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcasts. Maria Gallucci is a clean energy reporter at Canary Media. She focuses largely on hard-to-decarbonize sectors, and lately she's been reporting a lot on the wind manufacturing business. Hey, Maria.
Hey, Stephen.
Jeff St. John is the Director of News and Special Projects at Canary Media. He's known for his extremely meticulous deep dives on a wide range of technical subjects. And Jeff, you've been real deep in it with the IRA lately.
I've been trying. Yeah, there's a lot to cover. And thanks for having us on to talk about it.
Julian Spector is a senior reporter at Canary covering storage and manufacturing, among many other things. And he's been a man on the move visiting factory sites. You've been on the road a lot.
It's true, yeah. I'm one of the reporters on our team who I don't have any cats or corgis or small children, so they could kind of send me off into the wilds, and I'll, just roam around until I get the story.
All right, so each of you is covering a different beat related to the IRA, and I think your combined expertise can tell us a lot about how the nearly $400 billion in climate spending is actually starting to impact the energy economy. So I want to start with a question for each of you, the same question, which is, how would you characterize the last year by choosing just one word? And then I want you to explain why you chose it. So Maria, you go first.
One word to describe the Inflation Reduction Act, I'd say anticipation. There's a lot of news. There's a lot of wondering what the guidance will be for some of these programs, a lot of expectations and hopes for how it might accelerate clean energy development. But we're still sort of in that anticipation phase, I would say.
Yeah, my word for the first year of the Inflation Reduction Act is I'm going to go with everywhere, because while it's true we're still anticipating a lot of the details, we've just already seen real material changes on the ground in far-flung places. I didn't expect a first kind of multi-day storage factory to pop up in West Virginia necessarily if we were making bets a few years ago. And, Louisiana's doing its own energy transition things. Hawaii's working on a hydrogen hub. Like, there's just all over the place. You're starting to see real changes in factories and projects and things. So it's not just a handful of states leading the charge anymore.
I took the instruction to characterize how the rollout has gone so far, and I used an adverb, methodically, because let's face it, this stuff takes a lot of work to put into practice, moving the letter of the law into kind of real world programs, incentives, subsidies, and the like through all the federal agencies. And it's taken an enormous effort. DOE, Treasury, EPA have been just really overloaded with work. And I think that may have led to some anticipation and perhaps some concern from folks who want to see it happening faster. But I think that the results of this methodical approach, according to the folks I talked to, are program designs that are largely laying out a pretty strong foundation and framework for this money to actually go out and do the transformative stuff it's supposed to do. There are some noteworthy caveats on that, but for the most part, we are starting to get to the point where the rubber is starting to hit the road on this.
All right, so Jeff, let's go to you to talk about some of the meticulous crafting of rules around incentives, because this is a really key piece of how a lot of the spending is going to happen. And as you say, there are rules being crafted inside the Department of Energy, at the IRS, at the Treasury Department, inside the EPA, some other entities, and there are a bunch of tax credits and subsidies here that all need to be continually worked. Some have yet to be rolled out in terms of guidelines. So this is very complicated. Like, where do the major programs stand in terms of being real and ready to roll out when you look at like the main subsidies for deployment and manufacturing?
Yeah, I'd say that when it comes to the kind of clean energy deployment and manufacturing side, the wind, the solar, the EVs and the batteries, there's a couple key guidances from the Treasury Department and IRS that have come out in the last couple of months that have been really important. One big one is the domestic content adder. Let's remember that the ITC and PTC, these investment in production tax credits that have been around for a long time, not only got extended through at least the next decade by the Inflation Reduction Act, but also had a bunch of adders brought to them. You can get a 10% adder for domestic content being a big part of your project. You can get another 10% adder for investing or building in an energy community. That's a place where there's a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure, and where economic impacts of closing it down could be significant. There's a 10% adder for low-income communities. And all of these things need to be defined. And their definitions can be somewhat controversial. The domestic content adder is a big one because there are a couple key things that the Inflation Reduction Act is trying to do that need to balance building up this domestic manufacturing and economic capacity to build all the solar and wind and batteries and EVs that we want, and deploy that stuff as fast as possible. And let's face it, for solar in particular, for EVs, to some extent, for batteries to a larger extent, most of that stuff is not made inside the US right now. So there's been quite a bit of attention paid by different sectors of those industries on just how the Treasury Department is defining what makes up domestic content. How much of that stuff needs to be made or produced or mined or assembled in the United States? How deep into the battery or the solar panel do you go? That's really complicated stuff. And in some cases, it's pitting companies or industries that are focused on building stuff here in the United States against companies and industries that are focused on putting the stuff that's built in other countries to work in the United States. So that's been tricky, and it's still in the works. But it's getting, progress is being made, and that's important because speed is of the essence, of course.
So let me pause you there because there are some other programs that we need to discuss. So when it comes to domestic content, the tax credits to promote domestic manufacturing, how is the specter of these credits or how is the utilization of these credits actually playing out? So Julian and Maria, you've been looking into how this is impacting battery manufacturing, solar manufacturing, wind manufacturing. Julian, how would you say this is starting to impact activity along what you call the battery belt?
Yeah, well, the most tangible outcome is like a whole roster of billion-dollar factories opening up quite rapidly. I mean, we're now just coming to a year, and I did my travelogue through the southeastern battery belt back in May, and there were already the first wave of factories opening up. Those ones had obviously been kind of developed and decided on before the IRA, but what was very palpable is the factories that had already been built, just seeing where the trends are going, they're expanding capacity. And then there's all these other factories coming that have now been announced and are getting constructed. And, it's kind of wild to see like a whole wide-ranging battery cell and EV manufacturing base spring up almost overnight, especially in a part of the country that was never that interested in, say, promoting electric vehicle adoption or mandating it, the way, say, California does. So, yeah, we're seeing a lot more battery cell production in the U.S. than there ever used to be. Some of the analysts I talked to anticipate a 10x growth in cell capacity by 2027.
And is that thanks to IRA manufacturing incentives?
Yeah, well, there's a few different incentives. So for storage power plants on the grid, there's now a standalone tax credit to build a battery plant, where in the past you had to stick it onto a solar plant to kind of claim the credit. So that is going to really help people building batteries, on their own to store the clean energy that's being made. And then, like Jeff mentioned, the domestic content incentives on the purchasing side. So both for electric vehicles and for the grid, if it's made here, you get more of a tax credit, and it creates these competitive pressures, because if you're not building here and your competitors are, you just can't be as cost competitive as them. So it sort of forces the business folks to do whatever they can to build it over here.
And Maria, how's this playing out a little bit differently in the wind business? These incentives are largely promoting new factories in batteries and solar. For the wind business, it's a little bit different. There's a lot of wind manufacturing already in the country, some of which has been closed. How are the incentives changing the nature of wind manufacturing in this country?
Sure. So, right, for solar, batteries, other types of clean energy technologies, these incentives are kind of ushering the first wave of domestic manufacturing. The U.S. wind manufacturing sector has largely existed, for decades, but it's kind of had this on again, off again nature. And in most recent years, a lot of domestic capacity for making blades and turbine towers in particular has declined because companies are finding it kind of more economically attractive to make these things overseas. So the Inflation Reduction Act is kind of bringing about what experts have called a second renaissance for the U.S. wind manufacturing space. Factories in Iowa and Kansas, other parts of the country that were idling or shuttered are now reopening and expanding even to not just resume production, but begin making larger turbines, which is sort of becoming the norm for projects. So it's breathing new life into this sector that has been very cyclical in nature. Analysts are hoping that this will kind of break the spell in a way that there can be some policy certainty, some financial certainty for the companies that make and develop wind parts.
Yeah, and the stuff that Julian and Maria are reporting on, these are manufacturing facilities that are very tangible. And Jeff, you're often reporting on like really arcane rules that ultimately, that maybe are hard for people to follow, but ultimately lead to these real world impacts. And there are still a lot of debates over how to structure some of the rules. What are some of the other flashpoints in terms of incentive structures that are still in play right now? The hydrogen one is obviously a big one. We covered that on the show. You've reported on that extensively. So hydrogen and what else? What are the big flashpoints?
Another big one is electric vehicles. The tax credit available to people who buy electric vehicles is predicated on a number of kind of domestic or free trade partner country manufacturing or kind of like supply rules. Those were the rules that Senator Joe Manchin, the Democrat from West Virginia, whose vote was critical to getting this passed through a evenly divided Senate, kind of insisted on, so that his fear was that China, the primary supplier of a lot of these EV materials, would win too much unless we, supported domestic manufacturing. And those rules are complicated. They have, in fact, barred several makes and models of EVs from receiving all of or any of the commercial or the tax credit that you get from when you buy a vehicle. And there's a big pending decision coming out of the U.S. Treasury Department that has to do with entities of foreign concern, which is a nebulous category, but which most people anticipate will include China. Starting at some point in the future, if you make a car that has any materials or batteries or components from an entity of foreign concern, you're not going to be eligible for that tax credit. That's going to be a big one. There's a lot of controversy over whether or not it's overly kind of restrictive to getting as many people to buy as many EVs as possible on one hand, and the idea that allowing China to continue to maintain its dominance in that part of the EV industry will undercut the hopes of building and kind of thriving U.S. EV manufacturing sector on the other. So tricky one, still in the works.
And something else, it's not quite a flashpoint, but just something to watch is going to be to what extent power plant developers are actually able to get all of those adders and file their paperwork and qualify, because right now there's the potential to basically get half off your new clean energy plant. It's like 30% tax credit if you meet these labor standards, and then add on 10 for domestic content and add on another 10 for the energy community thing. But we haven't seen people going out and like taking that swing and hitting all of those and qualifying yet. So we got to see like if there's any friction around that. But we have started to see, for instance, solar developers targeting old coal mines. I just wrote about one in Kentucky where they're literally building the 800 megawatt solar plant on a decommissioned coal mine. It seems clearly targeted at claiming those credits. So it is changing developer behavior already, which is cool to see.
What a fantastic time to be an energy tax law firm.
Absolutely. They're the real winners.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully the planet, but definitely the tax lawyers.
On July 18th, join Latitude Media and Banyan Infrastructure as we take a deep dive into the next phase of deploying the $27 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. We'll provide practical insights for the state agencies and local lenders at the front lines of dispensing these funds. Where are the bottlenecks? How do we balance speed with transparency? And can America's green banks live up to the expectations of both local communities and Wall Street? Latitude Media's Stephen Lacey, Banyan co-founder Amanda Lee, and Clean Energy Fund of Texas EVP Billy Briscoe will answer these questions and more on July 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern. This is a must-attend for project developers and financiers. Register for free at latitudemedia.com/events or click the link in the show notes.
I'm Julia Piper.
I'm Brandon Hurlbut.
And I'm Emily Dominich.
A little over a year ago, political climate took a break so we could focus on the groundwork of implementing America's biggest ever climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm excited to say, political climate is back. And I'll be joined by my two co-hosts to riff on the top political stories and insider scoops, from state houses to the halls of Congress to regulatory agencies and even international climate talks. We'll explain how those developments are driving industry decisions today.
Political Climate is a show for people who want authentic conversations.
And to learn about how energy and climate policy is shaped within both political parties from the people who have actually helped shape it.
So join me, Brandon, and Emily every other week, starting in April, for fresh episodes of Political Climate. Subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts.
You know, I want to go back to the foreign investment piece, because I think the U.S. clean energy ecosystem has benefited from a lot of foreign direct investment. You know, in the battery space, I think we see a decent amount of South Korean companies investing in that market. Historically, in the wind business, it's been a lot of European players that have been advanced manufacturers that have invested in the U.S. More than half of the incentives are actually on the manufacturing side are being taken advantage of by firms outside the U.S. So it's significant. And it can ultimately be a good thing. We want to attract more foreign direct investment, but we also want to make sure that American companies are able to blossom as well. So can any of you speak to the foreign companies that are active here and whether or not the structure of those incentives will impact that level of activity from outside the U.S. back into the U.S.?
Totally. Well, yeah, South Korea is a huge player in this, and SK is one of the big kind of conglomerates that's made a big play. They weren't really big on the radar as far as manufacturing batteries for the U.S. market before all this, but they were the first to open a big $1 billion one in Georgia, and they've struck all these partnerships with American automakers so that they can, spin up battery lines just, within 100 miles or so of the car factories that are going to then take those batteries, put them in a car, and then it rolls off, to market. And yeah, there've been a few others. I mean, Q-Cells is a solar manufacturer that has already had a factory in Georgia, but they're drastically scaling up capacity and even adding the cell and wafer, like the earlier precursor steps, so that it's a full U.S. based supply chain for their solar production. And I think there is a sort of geopolitical dimension to it, because politically right now both parties are taking a tough stance on China, and there have been some Chinese companies trying to come in and do these sort of battery partnerships too, but those get way more scrutiny politically, whereas South Korea is looked at as kind of like a friendly and non-threatening kind of ally to work with here.
It's important to remember that, particularly when it comes to tax credits, I mean, not only are tax credits incentivizing capital investments and job growth in the country, to get a tax credit, to make something of it, you got to pay taxes in the United States. So that's kind of a nifty trick. I do know there are complexities around here. I was just reading about guidance from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development about how multinational companies will be taxed under the good old global anti-base erosion model rules. I'm sure there are interesting complexities about how multinationals make use of U.S. federal tax credits. But I think that's an important point to remember.
Maria, how's this played out in the wind business?
Yeah, in the U.S. wind manufacturing space, a lot of the major players are European or Chinese companies. General Electric is obviously a huge kind of U.S. player, but it's definitely a global industry. A lot of the expertise in manufacturing base has been kind of developed and advanced overseas. And even though there has historically been a presence in the U.S., I think the goal is to kind of bring some of what's been happening elsewhere domestically through Chinese companies, European players, and U.S.-based companies also.
Let's talk about the wind business a little bit more. I mean, the wind business, more than any other clean energy business in the U.S., has been a victim of these boom-bust cycles. If you look at this chart of the PTC expiration, you can see activity rise and fall as the tax credit has passed and then expires again. In the solar business, you've had a lot of state-level incentive programs and really robust programs on the local level that have kept solar going even through tough times. And the wind business has really suffered in a big way when you see these boom-bust cycles, and that has hit manufacturers pretty hard. Can you talk about that history and then how that might change under the IRA with longer-term, more consistent tax credits?
Sure, yeah. So the first utility-scale wind farms were developed in California in the 1980s, and then the broader wind energy sector really took off in the 90s with the passage when Congress passed the production tax credit, the PTC. And that gives developers a few cents for every kilowatt hour of electricity that their wind farms develop. And it's crucial. It's basically, how developers can make these projects pencil out. And so every few years, though, Congress kind of hems and haws, and maybe it'll lapse and maybe they'll bring it back. And whenever that happens, you see this spike in development of wind projects and then this crash. And it kind of has been that way since 92. For manufacturers, that means that they are also ramping up, ramping down in step with the developers. They don't want to be in a position where they have all of this inventory and nowhere to put it because, these turbines, the blades alone are hundreds of feet long. It costs a lot of money, and you don't even have the place to let it pile up. So they try and match their manufacturing pretty close to development. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, it's going to extend the existing PTC for a couple years, and then we'll replace it with a clean energy tax credit that applies not just to wind, but to all sorts of emission-free technology sources. And the goal is to give them more policy certainty and longevity, which in turn will enable manufacturers to kind of have more predictable flows of, how many turbine blades do we need, how many gearboxes do we need, how many motors, et cetera.
Julian, you hinted at this in one of your first answers, but what was the outlook for clean energy manufacturing before the IRA compared to after the IRA?
It's pretty completely changed. I think for the last decade or so, as clean energy has been ramping up, it was kind of implicitly acknowledged that everyone was assuming this would just be an import-based industry. Like, no one was really going out and hammering that point. But, if you could get it cheaper from China or cheaper from Southeast Asia and install a lot of clean energy that way, fight climate change, why not? It seemed that was sort of the consensus. And now within just a year, it's already flipped to this idea of make as much as we can in the U.S. And you're even hearing people like I talked to the Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm. She's talking about getting to a point where the U.S. can export clean energy and that this can actually push the global fight against climate change along faster because the U.S. will be kind of making so many great energy technologies that they can export to places that don't have their own factories and help it that way. So that's like a complete, we don't know if we'll get there, at the very least, it'll be many years before we're actually able to meet our own needs, which of course are drastically growing as a part of this. But we're certainly, making a run at it. And I just saw a new solar factory announcement today from First Solar. Like it's every week it seems like there's some new additional capacity getting greenlit.
It's important to remember that these tax credits aren't just for folks who buy and deploy these technologies. There are also a lot of tax credits for folks who make these technologies. Specifically, there's this new program called 45X. This is something that hasn't existed before for U.S. clean energy and technology manufacturers. It's a per unit production tax credit. The number of solar panels, battery cells, et cetera, you make, you get a tax credit. And that, I think, has been highlighted by folks in the U.S. manufacturing side as being kind of the key plank of this manufacturing renaissance that we're talking about. As a matter of fact, for the first 5 years of that tax credit, manufacturers are going to be able to receive that payment in the form of direct pay. Instead of having to offset it against their tax liabilities, they can just get a check cut from the U.S. Treasury for the amount of that tax credit, even if it exceeds, how much tax they have to pay. There are a couple of places where this direct pay is being put into place for the first time that is really kind of novel, and they can really kind of expand how much economic activity these tax credits are going to make happen.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep them all straight. 48C, 45X, 45Q.
They didn't make it easy for us. Yeah.
No. I think that the alphabet and number lobby had something to do with this.
Yeah, Sesame Street.
The Sesame Street lobby was definitely involved in the creation of these tax credits. So let's turn to some of the downstream impacts. Jeff, I know you're working on a story right now about the impact of direct pay, and I think what is really important about the way that the investment tax credit is set up is that historically entities that couldn't take advantage of these credits can now take advantage of them. So community level organizations, tax exempt organizations suddenly have a direct payment mechanism, and so they can be a part of projects that they historically couldn't be a part of. Love to get all of your takes on how this might start to impact the deployment of new kinds of projects and suddenly create a community level benefit that wasn't there before.
Yeah, absolutely. For the first time, non-taxable entities can get the value of tax credits under the direct pay provisions. That means city, municipal governments, municipal utilities. It means rural electric co-ops, which provide electricity to about 45 million Americans. It means the big federal agencies like the Tennessee Valley Authority, but it also means community nonprofit groups and community organizations. I talked to a CEO of a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit group that is working with a faith-based nonprofit in Baltimore, Maryland, to put direct pay to use for the first time in a youth center and main campus solar and battery project that's supposed to help reduce their energy bills and give people backup power during blackouts. There's just an enormous amount of potential demand from these nonprofit organizations, everyone who doesn't pay taxes, to put this money to work. It's kind of hard to know how much pent-up demand there might be because nothing like this has ever really existed before, but it could be significant. And it really does give community organizations the tools to capture the value of a tax credit mechanism that has largely been something that you have to have a relationship with a major bank or financial institution to take advantage of before.
And yeah, we should maybe back up and note that the U.S. has chosen to do its clean energy policy via the tax code for various political reasons. And in this case, they were able to pass this bill through the reconciliation mechanism. And so it sort of had to be more tax oriented. But there's a lot of real downsides to a tax-based energy policy, meaning, if the way you promote clean energy adoption is through tax credits, you have to have a tax burden to actually benefit from those. And like we joked about earlier, it's kind of funnels everything through this very professional servicey, contracts and law, lawyers and accounting and all of that. So I think you could think about direct pay as a way to democratize the access a bit, where suddenly you don't need to be a big Wall Street player or have friends who are big Wall Street players to benefit from these clean energy incentives. And it'll be really interesting to watch the public power sector and the municipals take advantage of that. We still don't know if they will to the fullest extent, but for a long time, all of the customers who are served by these public entities, their utilities couldn't build their own renewables in a way that was competitive with what a private for-profit company could do. So as a result, the TVA or other entities around the country had to sort of like contract it out and do these PPAs and let someone else benefit from the tax credits. And that's not exactly fair. So having a world where there's like finally a level playing field and all types of utilities, public or private, can really go full speed ahead on these is going to be a whole new dynamic to watch.
I would just add that the dynamic's also playing out at sort of the consumer level, the household level as well, that a lot of programs under the Inflation Reduction Act allow homeowners or households really to access benefits directly through rebates instead of through tax incentives, which have kind of historically been a big barrier for people interested in, weatherizing or making their homes more energy efficient, buying an electric vehicle, buying an electric bike, all of these things that you kind of need to make enough money to be able to receive that benefit. So, and I know Jeff's reported a lot on the HERA benefits as well. But yeah, just pointing out, but it's kind of across the board some changing the dynamic in a way that will kind of spread the benefits, hopefully, kind of more widely.
And so while we're on that point, I guess, Jeff, you have been focusing on that, some of the home efficiency rebates. There's also this big question about how the lending authority under the federal Green Bank will come together. I don't think it's called the Green Bank. What is it called?
The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund.
That's right, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Yeah, that morphed into that. So, but that is all still very much in development. So, where does that stand?
Let's see. Actually, the EPA, which is in charge of this Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which a lot of folks shorthand as a National Green Bank, has just started putting out guidance for how folks can start to apply for that money. We're talking about $27 billion in total. It gets a little confusing because $7 billion of that is for a specific kind of subset of solar and energy efficiency projects that came in under a separate piece of legislation that got folded into the IRA. And then you got $20 billion that is for the formation of this federal green bank. Of that, $8 billion is focused on low-income communities. And the idea of a green bank is you've got a public or quasi-public entity, and it goes out and it looks for places that really have trouble borrowing money to do stuff that helps the climate or helps their energy spend. And you go and you make loans and you prove out that the loans are good loans, that you can pay them back, and you draw in private sector lending kind of in increasing amounts as you kind of prove out that these are good loans for the private sector to make. So the big kind of multiplier value there, which has been proven out by some of the state and county level green banks out there, Connecticut, New York being some of the earliest and biggest, as well as a solar loan fund in Florida, is that you get a big multiplier on the private sector kind of lending that comes along with a green bank loan. So, but there's never been a kind of federal entity to do this. This has been a big push of the green bank backers for decades now. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund makes it happen. There's going to be a combination of kind of centrally directed lending as well as money being moved out to community development financial institutions. And we're going to see what happens. It's going to be very interesting to see the applications come in. It can be everything from community solar on low-income family housing to energy efficiency projects. There are some Washington, D.C. projects that are doing like stormwater retrieval and control. And there are some projects in Connecticut and elsewhere that are financing third-party solar development in underserved communities. So there's a real wide variety of stuff that you could really see proving itself out to the private sector that these are good loans to make and really expanding the capacity of the private sector where most of the money is to really drive a lot of investment in these places that have been historically kind of barred from being able to get at it before.
I think the last piece we want to touch on is the industrial sector. And Maria, this is an area that you focus a lot on. You focus on aviation, heavy industry, heavy transport. And there's this, one particular tax credit, the 45Q tax credit, that will go toward carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I wonder, how is the carbon management industry potentially benefiting from that? And is there anything in heavy industry that is starting to evolve as a result of the IRA?
So in terms of the 45Q, from what I understand, and this might be an evolving definition, but at least initially, 45Q applied to projects that captured carbon dioxide and stored it permanently in some sort of geologic reserve. And so that would not apply to projects that potentially are capturing carbon and turning them into sustainable aviation fuel, or, using them to make lower carbon concrete. So that is, but as far as I understand, that's still the case, although it might be evolving. And obviously, companies that are using carbon would certainly want to be able to take advantage of these tax credits if they can. I would just add that I believe this is under the Infrastructure Act, but the Department of Energy also has a $6 billion program to accelerate innovation in the hard to decarbonize space. So steel, aluminum, chemicals, a whole range of industries that contribute a lot to the country's greenhouse gas emissions, to the world's emissions, but for which there aren't sort of easy solutions. Certainly using renewable energy where possible will make a big difference, but a lot of times in heavy industry, it's the chemical reaction, it's the actual process that's generating emissions, and that we're still kind of working to find these alternatives for.
I think we might actually start seeing a real carbon capture market appearing in the next decade because of these credits. And just an anecdote about that was I was in Houston this spring for a kind of decarbonization conference, and was sort of surprised to see these guys on stage with like the nicest looking kind of custom made cowboy boots I've ever seen, like real like money making Texas entrepreneurial types, and they are developing carbon capture projects to make money on them, and that's kind of a big shift from the past few decades. You've seen really a pretty small number of power projects trying to add on carbon capture as like a proof of concept. And even if it's a major oil company doing it, they've never performed all that great. It's always sort of disappointing. And then you have the climate activists saying, oh, carbon capture is just a fossil fuel scheme to keep, making money and keep harming the planet. And that was kind of this impasse for a while. But now it seems like these credits are actually significant enough to get people going out and hooking up pipelines and finding these basins, and still very much not clear that it will make sense as a like power play, but for the heavy industry where there's just going to be emissions in the next decade no matter what. Now there's actually like some real juice there to try to catch them and put them in the ground.
So we can't really have this conversation about industrial decarbonization without talking about the Loan Programs Office, led by a friend of the pod, Jigar Shah, who has $400 billion in loan authority in his office, and is trying to figure out how to attract a lot of companies from a lot of different industries to start applying. And I think that's the biggest job he has ahead of him, along with the diligence, the really serious diligence that they're doing for some of these deals. But many of these deals are completely different from what we saw under the last big flurry of loan guarantees that were largely for renewable energy projects. These are for large industrial decarbonization projects ranging from hydrogen to advanced nuclear to carbon management to long duration storage and different kinds of storage. So, Jeff, what kind of activity are you seeing from the loan programs office? What's interesting to you and what feels different?
Well, you're right that they're doing a lot of stuff they've never done before, but that's kind of like it's meeting the moment, right? They've loaned money to companies that are building synthetic graphite for batteries in this country for the first time, companies that are mining and processing lithium in this country at scale for the first time, companies that are building nifty wire harnesses for batteries that can cut the weight and complexity of putting battery cells together for the first time. But what I think is the most kind of intriguing part of the LPO portfolio is this $250 billion in lending authority for something called the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program. It's also called Section 1706. And this money has a really wide remit. It can go to helping to close down and replace coal plants with something cleaner. It can go to transforming oil refineries into low, no carbon fuel refineries. It can go to building new transmission capacity to allow new clean energy to be built. And the key function that serves, at least as Jigger has described it, is to lend money to repurposing the dirty energy infrastructure that we have today to clean. Because there's a lot of ways to build new clean stuff. It's a lot harder for the financial sector to envision financing the conversion of dirty stuff to clean. That's going to be very interesting. We're still waiting for more clarity on just what might happen with it. We've got nuclear power plants that might want to keep themselves running with it. We have coal plants that could be converted to battery storage or small nuclear reactors or wind and solar farms. There's really an enormous range of stuff that could be funded with that.
All right, we covered an extraordinary amount of ground, but that's what the IRA does. So I think I agree with your characterization, Maria, that anticipation is a really apt descriptor for this moment. And so if we're thinking about that, if we're anticipating what's next, how are you going to judge whether it's been successful, when we actually get past the anticipation phase and get deeper into the execution phase, how will you determine success, or how will the people you're talking to determine success?
Yeah, I think there's so many ways to define success. I mean, obviously, most important for the climate is in terms of emissions reductions, in terms of amount of clean energy deployed and, replacing fossil fuel infrastructure. But I think another metric of success that I'm hearing groups talk about more often is how these projects are developed. Are they developed with public buy-in, community engagement? Do people want these facilities there? And that would be potentially, a big change from how projects have been developed in the past, especially in terms of sort of these polluting industrial infrastructure. Are we developing clean energy in a way that supports workers, supports people who are living near these facilities, but hopefully undoes some of the harm to the extent that we can, that other industries have done historically. So that's what I'm hearing a lot of it from folks is sort of, can we build new things in a new way, as we transition the economy.
Julian, you've traveled the country. You've talked to a lot of people who probably have different definitions of success based on where they live. How are they judging success, and how would you judge it?
Whoa, there's so many different ways. I mean, I think on the manufacturing side, one metric for success is does clean energy become this pillar of good jobs for American workers? I think that's already well on its way to that in just a year's time. But that's a huge shift if you think about it from having jobs in installing and developing these projects in the past to now. In many of these states I've been to, like, new clean energy factories are the biggest new job creators in the entire state. And we're talking like Georgia, Tennessee, West Virginia, places that are really eager to have these, even if politically their elected officials weren't, super on board with the Inflation Reduction Act. But I think on the big picture, certainly emissions is the ultimate metric. And my new reporting for the anniversary week is looking at where we're actually headed on the emissions trajectory now. There's been a whole slew of studies from all the energy modelers. And if you average out the outlooks now, we're headed for, on the high end of the spectrum, cutting the U.S. emissions economy-wide 40% from the 2005 levels by 2030. You recall that the goal for the country under the Paris Agreement is 50%. So it's taken us much closer to achieving that goal than we were without the Inflation Reduction Act. Also doesn't seem to be everything we need to get there. But these are all models that are kind of trying to anticipate what's happening with adoption, as we said, before all the rules are written and before all the gears are totally in motion. So, it's very much possible that once the work gets going in earnest and additional, power plant regulations and state level policies and things like that kick into gear, that could carry the country the rest of the way to the 50% goal. But some of the numbers are kind of wild on like the power production overall could get up to like 90% carbon free by 2030 in the National Renewable Energy Lab study. That's like the high end. So it's very possible we'll have a totally transformed electricity sector by the end of the decade as a result of this.
Jeff, you are right in the middle of some very intense debates. Some of those debates pit industry groups versus progressive green groups. Sometimes they pit industry against industry, but there are very stark contrasts in views over like what would determine success when you roll out incentives. How are you judging success when you look at some of these incentive debates, and then just generally programmatic wide, what are your metrics for success?
Yeah, well, obviously we want to see the forecast of what the Inflation Reduction Act can do across emitting sectors to play out and to reach the high ends of those expectations. We're going to be watching that. There's some worries that the policy could actually lead to an increase in emissions. We want to guard against that. But I think that the key is to make manifest the reality of the fact that all these green technologies are actually economically better than the fossil fuel alternatives. I mean, wind and solar power is far cheaper to produce than fossil fuel power. Electric vehicles are far cheaper to run and fuel and own over their lifetime than our fossil fuel vehicles. Energy efficiency in homes costs a lot of money up front, but it pays off dividends over the long term. These are all economic facts, but we haven't been able to convert the way we do business and make investments to take advantage of them. I think that if the Inflation Reduction Act's policies work, they will have gotten us through that transition phase to the point where all of the private sector capital that is unable to invest and make real those truths about clean energy can, at the end of this 10-year phase, be fully committed to making those investments and earning those profits as a result of these fundamental facts. And then we'll all be better off. I mean, it's such a dramatic change from the idea of climate change being something that we all have to pay to combat to climate change being something that we all benefit from combating. And that's not to mention the fact that we're saving the planet.
I think that's such a good point. Like, remember when the discourse was like, let's impose a tax on carbon and make everyone can pay a little bit more, and then we'll fight climate change. And now that's just like gone from the conversation, and instead it's like, well, what if you got new jobs and saved money on your car and, lowered your costs of living, and, it's the Inflation Reduction Act, if we can like permanently lower everyone's energy bill, then they can spend that money on other things. Like it's a totally different kind of vision of fighting climate change in a way that like materially improves people's lives in the process.
couldn't agree more. And as Jigar Shah likes to say, it's the greatest wealth opportunity on the planet. And a lot of people are coming around to that. Year one was big. Year two is going to be pretty gargantuan. I know you'll be following it. Julian Spector, thanks so much.
It's always a pleasure.
Jeff St. John, thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Maria Gallucci, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
The Carbon Copy is a co-production of Postscript Media and Canary Media. You can find all of the coverage from these reporters in our show notes. We'll have a link to the main page that synthesizes all the year one reporting on the IRA and the impact on manufacturing and deployment. Sean Marquand is our engineer. Dalvin Abawaje is my co-producer. Original music came from Sean Marquand, Echo Finch, and Blue Dot Sessions. And Postscript is supported by Prelude Ventures. Prelude is a venture capital firm that partners with entrepreneurs to address climate change across a range of sectors, including advanced energy, food and agriculture, transportation, logistics, advanced materials, manufacturing, and advanced computing. And if you want to disagree, agree with anything that we talked about in this pod, hit us up on social media. You can find all the folks on this conversation on X, I guess. I guess we're calling it X now. I still want to say Twitter. I can't find it on my phone. But I guess you can find us on X and give us a rating on Apple and Spotify. That's hugely helpful. Send the show to a friend or colleague, and we'll catch you next time. I'm Stephen Lacey. This is The Carbon Copy.